Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we are going to do the Sabaton history for In Flanders Fields. I skipped this one the other day. I can't remember what I did right after it, but I wanted to get back to it before I totally forgot. After this, I have a string of videos, like three or four, that I'm wanting to get out pretty quickly. So I'll be straying away from Sabaton and going more in the history realm for at least the next three or four videos. But we're going to do the Sabaton history for In Flanders Fields. Let's get into it.
Song with no guitars, with no drums, with no Sabaton.
But we did it in Flanders Fields.
At 5:10 a.m. in the early morning of November 11th, 1918, the German delegation agreed to sign an armistice. Nearly 4 years of unrelenting fighting, killing, and dying in the Great War, the First World War, seemed finally to be coming to an end. The news of the upcoming ceasefire spread like wildfire through the ranks of both sides. Fighting would be stopped at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. However, there was still time until then. Attacks had been planned and scheduled for the morning. Ammunition for the artillery had been prepared, and soldiers had already gathered in the trenches. And indeed, the celebrations in the ranks were quickly quelled by the commanders because the attacks planned for the day were still on.
So if you're on the Allied side of this, that's got to be more than a little bit frustrating, especially if you're on the French side of this, who the French have been having trouble within their ranks for a long while by this point. So if you're on the Allied side, you've already won. You've already won. I don't see the use of sending more men in to die. And the argument that's made about the pricks that the commanders and generals were in World War I, stuff like this doesn't do them any favors. Because then you look at it and say, okay, well, why is this being done then? Why are more lives being sacrificed when we know the armistice is about to be signed? Well, then it goes to ideas of, for lack of a better term, glory or something along the realm of individual, like, not responsibility, that's way too endearing of a term, but the idea that, like, you it's kind of like an ego thing. Like, you want to advance, you want to be well known, you want, that sort of thing. And you're willing to just throw lives away for it. That just, I don't know, that seems extremely harsh. And for as much as I think there's a little bit, it's kind of too harsh, the talk about the Allied generals, the Entente generals in World War I, stuff like this, kind of gives me the idea that, like, okay, well, I can kind of see what they're talking about.
Only a handful of officers purposefully delayed or just ignored the orders to send their men into battle to maybe die mere hours before the end of the war. Some career officers saw their last chance to win glory and recommendation. Others as their duty to follow Allied Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch's desire to punish the Hun as much as possible. So, while people in cities all over the world went out in the streets this morning,
those are just not good enough excuses to me. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but those just do not seem like good enough excuses to me.
Celebrating the end of the war, the men in the trenches went out to fight one last time. Up until 10:59, the Allied artillery shot as many of their shells on the German positions as possible as the men went over the top. The surviving German machine guns and artillery gave answer. On this morning alone, 11,000 casualties littered the ground on the Western Front. Ground
For what? For this? Ugh.
that had already been promised to be relinquished by German high command upon signing the armistice. At 11 a.m., the guns went silent. The Great War came to an end. The final attacks, the last hurrah, had achieved nothing but more death. And who could have justified the fate of those last soldiers dying in this war? What could have been said to the hundreds of grieving widows, parents, and friends that this bloody mourning had caused? The Belgian city of Mons was retaken this morning by the British. Now, this was the place where the war had really started for the British Expeditionary Force back in the summer of 1914. Now, it was the same place where it had ended, for the cost of 1 million lives from all over the British Empire. The last soldier to die here, the Canadian George Price, killed at 10:58, would be buried in the same cemetery as the first soldier that had fallen here. For the generals, it seemed like poetic closure. For most people, it simply symbolized the futility of it all. Many might have remembered the words of Lawrence Bignon from back in August 1914, who wrote a poem honoring the fallen of the first battles of the war, a poem whose words were, by 1918, inscribed in monuments all over Great Britain. They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. It is often said that poetry speaks directly from a person's soul. Although it is defined by sets of rules and the need for structure and aesthetics that are only mastered by a few, poetry could be written by anyone, anywhere. And during the Great War, people wrote. Soldiers often needed a way to occupy their thoughts. Left with not much else than a pencil and a piece of paper, they began putting down those thoughts and feelings and wrote down what they had experienced and witnessed during times of extreme stress, hardship.
I've talked about this before. A lot of the writing that comes out of World War I is really, really incredible. But again, back to the deaths. That's so hard for me to comprehend. And as it makes me almost feel bad. I look at all of this stuff through the lens of strictly history, right? It's why I don't like doing stuff that is more modern day, because when you get closer to modern day, you have modern biases, you have like modern emotions, you have all of this other stuff that begins to cloud the factual nature of the truth. This makes me almost feel bad for my defense of generals on the side of the Allies. Because to me, I look at this as they're written about as if they are so callous and so harsh and do not give 1 ounce of thought to the lives of the men under them. And I'm not talking about, leaders in the trenches. I'm talking about more like broader generals, right? And so when I read that stuff and I see just how angry some of the people and even soldiers and vets who fought in World War I were about it, I then look at the other side and say, well, okay, but this was an entirely new way of doing warfare. The weapons are new, the tactics are new, even the kit and the uniform have new pieces to them, and sometimes it's almost brand new. And so, how are these generals to learn if not by trial and error? And so, the nature of war, and especially this war, is that trial is going to cost lives. There's just no other way around it. And so that's sort of my defense, and has been my defense, of the Entente High Command throughout the war. But man, does this seem extremely callous. The idea of, like, quote unquote punishing the Germans. Well, if that's the case, if you feel that way, that this is, this still has not been settled, then don't sign an armistice. Like, if it's worth that much to you, then continue to fight. But if it isn't, then it isn't worth the 11,000 extra men that you're going to send to die for basically nothing. Like, you're going to punish the Germans, and in turn, you absolutely punish yourself. It's just, I don't know. It seems like an extremely callous move to me.
Or excitement. The air is loud with death. The dark air spurts with fire. The explosions ceaseless are. Timelessly now, some minutes passed. Those dead strode time with vigorous life, till the shrapnel called an end. But not to all. In bleeding pangs, some borne on stretchers dreamed of home. Dear things, war blotted from their hearts. Isaac Rosenberg, Dead Man's Dump. Unlike a letter or a diary, poetry had to be written and rewritten time and time again to get the language and the rhythm right. But when well crafted, it could speak and even scream the feelings of people who lived through the same times and the same experiences, but who did not have the words to express it themselves. Beginning before antiquity, before Homer's Iliad spoke of war and tragedy in epic form, and continuing thousands of years later, ordinary soldiers tried to tell the story of their war, in this case, the Great War. In the beginning, they spoke of grandeur and glory to be won on the field of honor. War has its horrors, but has this of good, that its sure processes sort out and bind brave hearts in one intrepid brotherhood and leave the shams and imbeciles behind. Now turn we joyful to the great attacks, not only that we face in a fair field, our valiant foe and all his deadly tools, but also that we turn disdainful backs on that poor world we scorn yet die to shield, that world of cowards, hypocrites, and fools. Alan Seeger, on returning to the front after leave. But as the war grew longer and more savage and brutal over the years, its poetry changed as well. It began focusing less on ideals and heroes and more on death and loss. Wilfred Owen made a name for himself by writing about the tragedy of the war and wrote in the preface of his book in May 1918, "This book is not about heroes. English poetry is not yet fit to speak of them, nor is it about deeds or lands, nor anything about glory, honor, might, majesty, dominion, or power, except war. Above all, I am not concerned with poetry. My subject is war and the pity of war." If, in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce e decorum est, pro patria mori. Wilfred Owen, Dulce et decorum est. Those words, that Old Lie, as he calls it, are Latin, written by the Roman poet Horace, and mean, it is sweet and fitting to die for the homeland.
And this really is, there is this idea going into World War One, and it's not just on the side of, you know, the British or the French, or, you know, it's literally everywhere. You have this very, very old world idea of war that comes out of everywhere, of every corner that this war is going to be fought in. You hear things like glory, camaraderie, brotherhood, power. It's a very, you know, along the lines of what Indy's saying, it's a very sort of poetic and great idea of what war is and what war will be. And you actually have some vets that write about this during the war when they look around and see the chaos and carnage of what this modern war is, where they say, essentially, is this all that the younger ones will know of war? Is this, you know, is this the brotherhood and camaraderie and glory? Like, is this what that is? Because it sure looks a lot more terrible than that. I can't think exactly. I have a very particular one in my mind where the guy is writing about being down in a shell hole. And he talks about how he's freezing, he's pushing himself as far down into the hole as he can. His canteen is frozen. He can't light a fire. All of this stuff, and he says, you know, is this the glory of war? That really is a transformation that happens, because it's when you know what's going to happen, when you have hindsight. When you read what some of the earlier soldiers and young men going off to war think this is going to be, what their kind of ideals have led them to believe, and honestly, what some propaganda has led them to believe, it really, really kind of breaks your heart, because you just know that they're not, those ideals are not, and those ideas are not going to stay till the end. Even if they do, even if the person survives.
Owen did not agree. One poem that immortalized the dying in Flanders and in the Great War overall was In Flanders Fields by John McCrae. McCrae was a military doctor and a major of the 1st Brigade of Canadian Field Artillery. In April and May 1915, they were fighting the Second Battle of Ypres. It is believed that after witnessing the death of a dear friend, McCrae looked out over the bombed-out battlefield, devastated, torn, and blasted. But in that grimness, the poppy flowers still bloomed, despite all the poison and death in the soil. Those small crimson flowers bloomed and were soon associated with the blood the men had shed. When the wind blew strongly and the poppy petals flew around and settled on the field, it was like the blood of the fallen drenching the earth once more. In Flanders Fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you, from failing hands we throw, the torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who died, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. This phenomenon,
it really is beautiful,
was observed by the locals as well. Women sold poppies and made artificial ones out of cloth to collect money for war orphans who lived close to the battlefields. In August 1921, the artificial poppies were brought to London for the first time and attracted the attention of the British Legion, a recently formed charitable organization. Immediately, they began to import and distribute the poppies as well. On the next Armistice Day, they would sell them to gather money for the benefits of the many thousands of unemployed and struggling ex-servicemen. A first order for 1 million poppies was placed on November 11th on every corner in London, at every major park, theater, hotel. Bands of young girls sold poppies to the public. It was 1 shilling for those made out of silk and 3 pence for those made out of linen. Petals from actual poppy flowers were sold for £5, and single whole poppy flowers were auctioned for up to £90. Soon the poppy craze caught all of London and beyond. Nearly every pilgrim and tourist who came to honor the fallen on Armistice Day at the cenotaph wore one at their collar, and soldiers were given permission to wear them on their uniforms. By the end of the day, around 8 million poppies had been sold, and it was still not enough to meet the demand. A great deal of money had been gathered for victims of the war. In subsequent years, the poppy became the universal symbol of remembrance. Disabled ex-servicemen went to work to manufacture them. John McCrae's poem In Flanders Fields became a popular evergreen, and like the poppy itself, became a symbol of remembrance. Now,
I'm going to, you guys don't ever get to see it, but I have kind of a whole set here with globe and books and some other stuff up here that's kind of old stuff that I like or collect or come across over time. I'm going to see if I can find a made poppy flower that I can put up here in a vase, or even if it was covered in glass or something. I'm going to see if I can find one that I feel like would be cool up here.
In Flanders Fields is the last song on your most recent album, The Great War. You want to talk about why you decided how you were going to do that?
So, all in all here, we have a very, very high energy, very powerful album.
Yeah.
And potentially the strongest song we have ever written is the last real proper metal song, The End of the War to End All Wars.
Yeah.
And at the end of this song, because it's just rising and rising and rising, we get to the climax, which is maybe the most epic moment in all the Sabaton songs. We couldn't just stop the album there. The listener, the people needed something to like calm down to. And we wanted to end the album in a very honorable way, so to say. And so we needed something that was more quiet. We didn't know exactly what, but as we were doing the research for the album, I was spending a lot of time looking for poems from World War One. And obviously then, you can't miss this one.
No, it's sort of the iconic one, too. I mean, that's a beautiful choice. I remember, and I've had to read it twice during the entire filming of The Great War, and it's really hard to read without actually, when you read it out loud, it's so powerful, especially talking about The Great War all the time. It's really hard to read. Challenge you. Try to read it out loud without, getting tears,
Challenge.
Now, writing poetry for a young man was a lot more common than that it is.
Yeah, I talked about that. It's super emotional
Today, although, of course, today, a lot of young men write, music lyrics, but this was a regular, everyday pastime for a lot of people. I mean, all your newspapers had poetry that was published in peacetime or wartime, pretty much every day by people that wrote it in, and you or I would have read it every day. It wouldn't have been weird or anything. So this was a major way to explain your feelings about the war, whereas today, if someone went to Afghanistan, you might think, oh, he wrote a poem about his feelings, but you might think that's a little odd. But it wasn't odd then. This was the way to write your feelings about that. And some of the other great World War I poets, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, I read a few of his, and he's one of the, up there with McCrae, who wrote In Flanders Fields. Wilfred Owen is one of the major iconic World War I poets, and his story is, well, many of the World War I stories, if not all, are tragic, but his is exceptionally tragic because not only was the famous poet, a famous war poet, he fought in the war as a regular soldier. He died fighting November 4th, 1918. That's 7 days, 1 week before the end of the war. You know, somebody had to be the last guy. Somebody had to be the guy. If you dies,
He wasn't the last guy.
he wasn't. You know, some guys died the morning of November
I know.
11th. You know, it's got to be really sad. Now, the Poetry Foundation has a whole World War I section. You can just Google World War I Poetry Foundation. It's all free to look around and stuff. You can find McCrae stuff. You can find Sassoon stuff. And I really like Wilfred Owen. He's probably my favorite.
And how can it be that some of them are so prominent? Like this one takes basically all the fame.
Well, it does now.
I was trying to find, you know, more of them, but this one takes the whole.
This became
spectrum.
so iconic for, especially for Canada. This is a real symbol of, because Canada's national identity, to a pretty big degree, was formed in the First World War. I mean, you have Canadian soldiers that said, we went up the hill as, you know, British soldiers, and we came down as Canadians. And same thing with the Anzacs, the Australians and New Zealanders. They forged a big part of their emerging.
Yeah, and they were a huge part of the war. I mean, I totally agree with that.
National identity in the war. And McCrae, of course, this is a big part of that. It's really funny because since we don't read poetry so often, but when you do read something that's so hard-hitting, you know, I mean, in Flanders Fields, it's poof.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think 10 points to you guys for doing that, you know?
And imagine in the future, I mean, okay, so we are writing now stories about about battles and stuff and about people. I wonder if we would write it if we were there ourselves.
Yeah. How you might write your experience. You know, it may be a power metal song, you know, but it would still be a hard-hitting song.
Like if we would go, let's pretend it will never happen. I mean, let's hope it will never happen. But what if we would go to war and we would have to sing about it or write poems? Would it be like a power metal song?
Man, that was a really good episode. The whole thing is pretty rough, but it was a really good one. That was the Sabaton history for in Flanders Fields. Man, if you have any other suggestions for videos, you can put them in the comments below, or I will put the link to the Discord in the description box. We have a whole thing over there where just YouTube suggestions go, and I go through there pretty consistently. So if you have a video you want me to see, in the comments or over there, as always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here, and I will see you all next time.